I'm 83 years old, and I spent 2 years of my life trying to make myself small enough to fit into the corners of my children's calendars. I called on Sundays. I texted during the week. I learned to say things lightly, the way you learn to walk on ice, carefully, so you don't slip and break something. And you want to know what happens when you spend 2 years trying to be convenient? You start to feel like junk mail, something people glance at on their way to the trash, something that sits on the counter and makes them feel vaguely guilty every time they walk past it. I didn't want to be junk mail. I'd spent 83 years being a real person. I wasn't about to spend whatever time I had left being a reminder of someone else's inadequacy. So I stopped. Not out of spite. I need you to understand that. I've known spite. I've held it in my mouth and learned to spit it out before it poisoned me. This wasn't spite. This was something quieter, something I should have discovered 30 years earlier, honestly. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, or at least the beginning of this particular chapter, because at 83 you don't really have beginnings anymore. You have chapters. Some of them you'd rather not reread. It was a Thursday. I remember because I'd made roast chicken, not from a rotisserie bag, not from one of those meal delivery kits my daughter Sarah likes to hint I should try, as though I've forgotten how to cook after 60 years of feeding people. Real roast chicken, with potatoes and carrots, and the kind of gravy that takes patience to get right. I'd been on my feet for 3 hours. My knees were complaining. My back was making its usual commentary. But the chicken was perfect, golden and crisp, and smelling the way a house is supposed to smell when someone's coming home. And I thought, I'll call David. David is my youngest. He lives 35 minutes away. I'll call him and say, "Come for dinner. I made your favorite." Because that's what I used to do. That's what mothers do. You make something good and you want to share it. He didn't answer. I left a message. I said dinner was ready if he wanted to come by. And I said it lightly. I know how to say things lightly. I've had decades of practice. I didn't say I haven't seen you in 7 weeks. I didn't say your father has been gone 15 years, and some days I don't speak to a single living person. I just said, chicken, come if you want. He texted back 4 hours later. Sorry, Mom, swamped today. Rain check? Rain check. I looked at that text for a long time. I looked at it the way you look at something that should mean something but has gone flat, like bread left out too long. And then I turned off my phone, sat down at the kitchen table, and ate my dinner alone. It was still good. I made sure to notice that. That was the day something shifted in me. I didn't cry. I'd cried plenty in the months before, quietly in the bathroom where no one could hear. Though of course there was no one to hear. I'd cried for Vincent, my husband, who left me 15 years ago on an ordinary Tuesday morning. So ordinary it seemed impossible that such an ordinary morning could contain something so enormous. I'd cried for the life we'd had together, 46 years, 3 months, and 17 days. Not that I was counting, though of course I was always counting. I'd cried because I didn't know how to be a person in a house that used to hold 2 people. I'd cried because I was lonely in a way I didn't have the vocabulary for. But that Thursday, with the chicken and the text message, I didn't cry. I was done with that particular kind of grief. I had moved into something harder and, strangely, more useful. I want to be honest with you about what I mean when I say my children ignored me, because ignore is a complicated word, and I think it does a disservice to the whole messy truth of it. My children didn't ignore me the way you'd ignore a stranger. They ignored me the way people ignore things that aren't urgent, the way you ignore a creaking step that isn't quite broken yet, or a bill that isn't due until next month. I was background noise, loved background noise. They'd have been devastated if something happened to me. I know that. David would have fallen apart. My daughter Linda, she lives farther away, in another state, a fact that has always felt more like a choice than a distance. Linda would have gotten on the first plane and wept at my bedside in a way that would have been entirely genuine and entirely too late. That's the thing nobody tells you about being old and being loved by your children. The love is real. It's just inconveniently timed. It shows up at funerals and hospitals and Thanksgiving. The rest of the year you're on your own. And for a while, I'm ashamed to admit this, but I said I was going to be honest. For a while, I tried to make myself smaller, to fit into the corners of their lives. I stopped mentioning that I was having trouble with the steps to the basement. I stopped telling David that the garage door had been sticking for 4 months because I didn't want to be the problem again. I stopped asking Linda to visit because she always said yes with such enthusiasm and then rescheduled with such apology that the whole cycle left me feeling worse than if I'd never asked. I became very good at saying, "I'm fine," in the exact tone that required no follow-up. Women of my generation are exceptional at that. It's one of our least useful gifts. But there's a cost to all that shrinking. Nobody talks about it, but I will. When you make yourself small enough to avoid being a burden, you eventually disappear. Not to them. You're still there, still their mother, but you disappear to yourself. You start to feel like a role, the mother, the widow, the old woman on Maple Street who used to be someone and is now a collection of needs waiting to happen. I was not going to disappear, not at 83, not after everything I had survived. Vincent used to say something. He had a way of saying things that sounded simple and turned out to be enormous. He used to say, "Laura, the only thing worse than being lonely is being lonely with people watching." I thought about that a lot after he died, because I was surrounded by love. Cards from Linda at Christmas, calls from David on my birthday, and I had never felt so completely, so profoundly alone, loved and alone. You don't expect those two things to live in the same house, but they do. So, Thursday, chicken, rain check. I decided to stop waiting for rain checks. The first thing I did was put the phone in the kitchen drawer. Not permanently. I'm old, not reckless. But I decided I was going to stop organizing my days around whether someone had called or texted or remembered I existed. I was going to stop checking, stop hoping, stop the particular quiet devastation of a phone that doesn't ring. That was harder than I expected. I'd had the phone for years, and I had not realized until I put it away how much of my daily emotional life had organized itself around its silence. Every hour without a call had become its own small rejection. The phone had become a kind of instrument for measuring my own unwantedness, and I had been checking it constantly, like a woman taking her own temperature to prove she was sick. I was done taking my temperature. The second thing I did, and this is going to sound strange, so stay with me. The second thing I did was I started keeping a record, not a diary. This was different. I got a small notebook, blue cover, spiral bound, and every day I wrote down one thing, one specific thing I had done that day. Not felt, done. Made chicken. Watered the orchid on the windowsill, the one Vincent bought me 12 years ago. Read 7 chapters of a novel about a woman in Ireland. sat in the backyard and watched a bird build something in the maple tree. Small things, but they were mine. They were the evidence that I was still a person who did things, not just a person things happened to. The third thing I did, and listen, this is where the story really begins, so pay attention. The third thing I did was I went for a walk. I live on a street that I have lived on for 28 years. And then about 9 months ago, a young woman moved in next door. Her name was Rebecca. She had a little girl, 4 years old, maybe 5. I could hear her sometimes through the fence, narrating whatever she was doing. I had waved at Rebecca a few times. She had waved back with the particular exhaustion of someone waving from underwater. She was always carrying something. I recognized that expression. I had worn it for years when my children were young and Vincent was working long hours. On the day I went for my walk, a Friday, I walked past Rebecca's house and saw her on the front steps. She was sitting with her elbows on her knees, looking at nothing. Her daughter was inside, and she just looked done. I should have kept walking. I sat down next to her on the steps. She looked at me, startled. I said, "You look like someone who could use 5 minutes of not being asked anything." She stared at me, and then she said, "That's the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in months." We sat together for a while without talking, and then she started talking. She'd moved here after a divorce. Her family was far away. She was tired in the specific way that doesn't get better with sleep. I listened. I'm good at listening. When she finished, she looked at me like she'd done something embarrassing. "I'm sorry," she said. "Because I sat down," I said, "and I didn't ask you anything." She laughed. I liked her immediately. Her daughter's name was Emma. Emma came to the door 3 minutes later and stared at me. She said, "Are you old?" And Rebecca said, "Emma," but I said, "Yes, extremely," and Emma nodded, satisfied. Within 2 weeks, Emma was coming to my house after school. Rebecca needed someone to be present with Emma for 1 hour in the afternoon, and I needed someone to be present with me for any amount of time at all. Emma was an astonishing child. She was curious. She asked me once why my hands looked different from her mother's, and I told her about what hands look like when they've been used for 83 years. And she held my hand and examined it. And then she said, "It's like a map." I nearly fell out of my chair. We baked. We made oatmeal cookies with raisins, and Emma ate 5 before they were fully cool. We read books. She was learning to read, and she would sound out words with fierce concentration. And when she got a word right, she'd look up at me for confirmation, and I gave it every time. I taught her how to water the orchid. I explained that plants don't need much. They need light and water and to be left alone the rest of the time. She found this deeply philosophical. "Like people," she said. "Some people," I said, "the ones worth knowing." Rebecca started coming too, after a while. She'd knock on the door after work, and I'd say, "Come in." And we'd sit in the kitchen while Emma watched something in the living room. And Rebecca would drink tea and tell me about her day, and I would tell her about mine. I told her about Vincent, about how the house still had the shape of him. She didn't say anything predictable about grief. She just said, "It sounds like you really saw each other." And I had to stop for a moment, because that was exactly it. We had seen each other, and being unseen after 46 years of being seen is its own particular kind of blindness. I told her about David and Linda, that my children love me and had forgotten how to include me, that I had spent months waiting by a phone I'd finally put in a drawer. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think people always mean to do better. They just don't feel the urgency until it's too late. I know, I said. That's what I'm trying not to need from them. And look, the thing I want to tell you is this. The loneliness doesn't go away when your children call more often. The loneliness that comes with this stage of life is structural. You cannot fix it with phone calls. What you can do is fill your days with things that are genuinely, specifically yours. Not things that pass time, things that use you, things that ask something of you. Emma asks something of me every afternoon. She asked me why old photographs were black and white. She asked me if I'd ever met anyone who became president. She asked me once whether I was afraid to die. And I said, scared some days. And she nodded and said, me too sometimes. Rebecca asked something of me too. She started asking me things. How I made bread. Whether she was being too soft or too hard on Emma. Whether it was normal after a divorce to still love someone you couldn't be with. I told her yes. I told her grief doesn't follow the rules. I told her about a friendship I'd had with a woman named Margaret and how we had a falling out and how I missed her for 25 years. I told Rebecca, grief doesn't need permission. You're allowed to miss people who are still alive. She cried, not dramatically. She cried quietly, and I didn't hand her a tissue. I just sat there with her. This is what I learned. You cannot make your children see you. You can be deeply loved and completely invisible at the same time. But you can make yourself so alive, so genuinely present in your own days, that the invisibility stops being the most important thing. You can find the people who need what you have. My hands shake now. I notice it when I water the orchid. They used to be steady hands. They held 5 babies. They still work. They just shake a little while they do it. David called me 4 weeks after the Chicken Thursday. He didn't know anything had changed. I said I was wonderful. I said I was teaching my neighbor's daughter how to bake. He said, wow, Mom, you sound really good. And I said, I am really good. And I meant it. He came for lunch the following weekend, not because I'd asked, but because something in my voice had shifted from a voice that was waiting to be visited into a voice that was simply living. And a living person is more interesting to visit than a waiting one. He brought my granddaughter, Sophie. Sophie and Emma met in the backyard, and within minutes were playing some game I couldn't follow. I watched them from the kitchen window while David sat at my table, and for the first time in a long time, I was only half listening, because I was watching 2 small people make a world out of a backyard, and I was thinking, I did that once. I know how it's done. Linda called the following month. She sounded slightly surprised. She asked questions about Rebecca, about Emma, and then she said, Mom, I've been worried about you. And I said, I know. And she said, I should call more. And I said, you should do whatever you have time for. I'm fine. She visited the next month. She stayed for 5 days. And she sat with me in the evenings, and we talked about things we hadn't talked about in years. Her marriage, her work, her children. I did not tell her it would be okay. She needed someone to sit with her in the not okayness of it. I could do that. On her last evening, after Rebecca and Emma had come for dinner, Linda sat across from me in Vincent's chair and said, I didn't realize how much I was missing. I looked at her for a long time. You weren't missing anything, I said. I wasn't going anywhere. I was here. I am here. I'm 83 years old. I have buried my husband, my parents, 3 of my closest friends. I have made chicken no one came to eat. I have waited by phones in kitchen drawers. And I have learned that a woman who is still building something is impossible to overlook for long. not because she demands to be seen, but because she is genuinely too busy to notice whether she is. Build something, anything, something that needs you tomorrow. And then, if they come, your children, your grandchildren, if they come, you'll have something real to show them. Not your loneliness, not your need, something you made with your shaking 83-year-old hands. That's all I have. One of my children called me last week and said, "Mom, people are watching these videos and talking about our family." I told them, "Good. Maybe someone needs to hear it." If this story reached you today, leave a like. I read every comment you leave, every single one. So if you've been through something like this, tell me. I'm here. Subscribe if you want to keep talking. Every week I sit down at this table and I tell you the truth, because someone has to.